This is WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. You are listening to One Human Nation with your host, Sandy Batiste. This program will be talking about race and race relations in your community and nationally. Our goal is to be open, honest, and productive.
Welcome to the One Human Nation Show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste. Welcome to another episode, and we are actually on show 31 of the One Human Nation Show. And, you know, this is the time of the year that I think everybody's feeling a little bit raw and a little bit tense from everything that's been going on throughout the year. And it's definitely been it's definitely been a lot to digest and to manage our emotions as we go through the final part of this holiday season and gearing up for the holiday season. And I do want to state that before we start this show, the viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. So we've listened to, throughout this program starting in April, several different shows that really speak to going through a reconciliation process and what that means internally and facing some truths about ourselves, as well as dealing with how we feel about ourselves as being Americans and part of our community, and what kind of unconscious bias that we may also be experiencing and how that's impacting our world. And sometimes it's immediately with our family. Sometimes it's a little bit more, it's not as direct as far as the connection to it. And so you don't exactly see it as apparently. So we talk a lot about, you know, looking at your internal awareness and taking the different implicit association tests. So I thought it would be good, before we really talk about some of the topics for this particular show, I thought it would really be good to talk about or listen to a clip from one of the previous shows that really speaks to, I think, what many of us are grappling with in dealing with how we have pictured our country and how our country actually is. So let's take a listen to this clip from a previous show. So the ROTC experience, it led you to, so you were a combat engineer. And
yeah.
what does a combat engineer do, and where?
Really all about being an American, you know. So there was this idea that, you know, to serve one country is meet and right, and that whatever America was doing was on par with what God wanted for the world, kind of thing.
Right.
And so, yeah, I was pretty gung ho. I joined the duty, I guess, in June of 2001.
Okay.
And so, yeah, a few months later, lots of things changed.
Mm-hmm.
September 11th kind of rolled around, and, you know, civil religion, and volunteered to go to the Middle East and a number of different places, primarily building runways and bases.
Okay.
So I was a mechanical engineer by training, and cross-trained over to civil engineer so I could get out of the office, and ended up out in lots of really hot places, planning out how to put aircraft in places that most people don't think to put aircraft. And
okay.
Yeah, and then all the support stuff that goes around with it.
So that's where your interaction, obviously, then is with a totally different culture. I mean, I'm just saying.
That's that's a reasonable statement. Yeah.
Yeah. So, talk to us a little bit about that. Because basically, you're helping to facilitate a war, and I don't think I always try to make sure I explain to people I love the United States of America. I am not in any way saying, I'm anti our government. But there is another narrative when you're there in another country and you're interacting with another culture, which I'm assuming for you that this was the first time that this had happened for you.
Yeah, by and large, it was. I had an aunt that was in the Peace Corps, and we traveled to Costa Rica, but that was more tourism kind of thing than anything else. Yeah. So this is really where working side by side with people, being in another culture in ways that were beyond pleasantries or an exchange of food and that kind of thing. So I was stationed primarily out of Qatar or Qatar or however you want to say it. Never gotten that down. Even living there for months on end. And had a really kind of sobering experience, both in the Muslim population that I worked with. So as an engineer, I spent a lot of time traveling around trying to secure either equipment or labor or materials that you just couldn't get over in time to build things. So I spent a lot of time interacting with people in country and contractors from all over the world, and those interactions really kind of opened my eyes to just how complex our presence in the Middle East was. That I came setting people free and keeping America safe, and for some folks it was a chance to really capitalize and make some money. For some folks, it was a chance to be able to further infrastructure in their country, and for some folks, it was occupation and exploitation. And I worked a lot with what were called third country nationals at the time, and these are people who are neither citizens of the country they are working in, nor citizens of the companies they work for. So, as an example of that, I worked with American contractors in Bahrain or Qatar that worked for companies from Italy or America, but the labor themselves usually came from somewhere in Asia. So I worked with a lot of Nepali folks that were the labor. To see how they got caught up in all of the comings and goings of a war was a really sobering experience. So particularly was the work conditions that they found themselves in, and how we, and I say we in a very kind of large sense, both as Americans, as supporters of American businesses and that kind of stuff, really had some kind of questionable practices in how we used that labor, and how they received it. So there was one point in time, where they weren't allowed to travel home. The living conditions were just really kind of awful.
They were pretty much slave labor.
Yeah, I mean, it's about as close as you can get,
right,
and still say that there's a payment, a transaction taking place. But that transaction was on the lower end, and sometimes they didn't have a whole lot of choice. Before our conversation, I went back and looked at it, at some of the stipulations for employing third country nationals. And there was once upon a time a practice where you could take their passport. They would surrender their passport. And so, I mean, we've gone back and corrected that, I think, since '06. But at the time, there was a practice where, you basically, had them where they had no other place to go.
Okay, so And I love one of the examples you get, but then that's partly because, I like some science fiction stuff, so
Oh, yeah,
you
yeah,
had
yeah.
provided a link in reference to Star Wars, so, the listeners just have to indulge us for a minute, because can you describe that as far as the
Sure.
Galactic Empire and the whole Star Wars reference?
Yeah. So I'd come back from serving with in the Middle East, and with a lot of questions, the things that I saw in the way that we were received by a number of different groups. We didn't always feel like the good guys, and a lot of the things that we didn't always, I didn't always feel like the good guy kind of stuff. And there was this silly little YouTube clip about a bunch of stormtroopers sitting around reminiscing about when the Death Star blew up and where were you, and it had this intentional take on where were you when the towers fell kind of thing. And
Right.
yeah, there was this this kind of moment of awful realization that I had always pictured myself growing up, and again, Luke Skywalker, the plucky little farm boy kind of stuff, going to free the universe. And there was that moment of like, oh man, I look a whole lot more like a stormtrooper occupying someone's planet, and that put a lot of cracks in my narrative.
Okay. Well, that was one of the excerpts from a previous show. And one of the things that when at the end of the show, I'm going to reference the particular show numbers that you can go back to and listen to in more detail. But I wanted to play that clip because I think it speaks to what a lot of people are going through now. I kind of went through this realization, several more years back in my reconciliation journey, or my journey, as far as realizing that the stories we were being told about our country and what we were doing and all the good we were doing out there and why we were going to this country and why that war started. I got the blinders kind of stripped off when things just weren't jiving for me. Things were not reconciling in a way that I could continue down that path without going, well, wait a minute. And so one of the things that I encourage you to be curious about, if this hasn't already hit your radar, is to take a look at the horrendous activity that's been going on with the Libya slave market. And so what I've done is I've posted on the One Human Nation website. That's onehumannation.info. When you have time, go back to that website. I have a resource page up now. And I found a documentary that really speaks to telling this story over a long period of time. And I think the outrage when it did finally hit, there was also this like, what took so long? Because things have been destabilized in this country, in Libya, for quite some time. And there are people that go back and look at the politics and who was to blame, and who, when we went into this country and it was already destabilized, it was already bad. And then things went from, as impossible to think, went from bad to worse. And the worst is what we're seeing in the Libya slave market. And so there's a side of me that thinks, well, maybe it did not raise the alarm the way it should have, because it involved people of color. Africans that were in poverty, Africans that were feeling desperate. And one of the things, as I looked at the information, which, you got to love the internet because there's so much out there, but this was from one of the reporters who was, boots on the ground, so to speak, and trying to talk to these migrants and say, you don't want to do this. This is not a safe way to get away from poverty. And there's a quote from two women in Niger that told him, even when he tried to warn them, they basically told him, in life, there are always risks. We will be amongst the successful ones. And I think that spoke to me because there is so much focus on, well, we need to protect our borders. We need to, build a wall. We need to do all of this to think that that's going to stop the wave of people that are in poverty conditions and in horrible conditions. And it hasn't worked because they don't believe that what they're going into could possibly be any worse than what they already have, what they're already experienced, and they're willing to take the risk. And so some of the information, as I look through some of the statistics from this information, and it was really appalling. In the documentary, when you take a look at it, or if you even look at part of it, if you haven't seen some of the videos coming through, if you're on Facebook, but looking at the documentary really kind of gives you a picture of how bleak the situation must be for people to take on the journey that they go through. And so one of the statistics shows that there have been 2,550 refugees and migrants that have died from the beginning of the year 2017, and they're spanning the period 2017, January 2017 to September 13, 2017. So that's 2,550 refugees and migrants that have died. And so that is coming out to be one death in every 50 people who actually make it to try to get to the shores of Italy, to try to get out. And of course, the Italian government is doing what they can to stem this happening, because at the end of the day, I think countries are, it's like, well, how do we manage the people that are coming in, and how is that going to be absorbed into our culture and into our country? And I think it's a very real concern for a lot of people. And so I wanted to talk about this global issue and the shock that it brought to people in America, in that sense of realizing that, there are some really bad and awful things going on in the world. And some of those things are things that were triggered by the United States. And it's not a pretty picture to try to get your head around. And there are people that say, well, that's because of XYZ political party, and that's because of, that's what was then, and it was all, well, for me, it doesn't matter which political party. This is where we are. And our entire political system, I think that everyone can agree that's reasonable people. The level of corruption is there. That doesn't mean other countries do not have corruptions, but because it is, but it speaks to being awake and waking up to the fact that living in the United States is it's a wonderful place to live. I love my country, but there are some issues that we need to work on, and we need to be able to talk about these issues and feel safe and have an honest and open dialogue about some of the things that are happening that are having a ripple effect. So what led me from looking at this horrific global issue was then taking a look at what was happening with human trafficking in general. So this has been a problem that has been addressed through the State Department, to the point that they actually now have a trafficking report out there for 2017. So if you Google it, you'll find the trafficking report. And they title this particular document as The Face of Modern Slavery. And they break down these categories for the face of modern slavery for trafficking. And some of them are very much active in the United States. So they talk about sex trafficking and child sex trafficking. So they make a distinction between adults engaged in commercial sex acts such as prostitution as a result of force, threats of force, fraud, or any combination means that this person is a victim of trafficking. They talk about the child sex trafficking, which they're targeting youth under the age of 18. They talk about forced labor, bonded labor, debt bondage, where people are thinking that they're going for a better way of life only to not be able to pay the debt to get out of bondage and working in horrendous conditions. And they are too afraid to address the issue because they don't have any legal status. They have a category for domestic servitude, forced child labor, and unlawful recruitment and the use of child soldiers. And when I started looking at this, it led me to really taking a look at, well, where is this and how is this looking in the United States? Because unfortunately, we have a tendency, or I have a tendency, when I hear something that's horrific, I like to think, well, that's not happening in this country. That's got to be happening someplace else, because we're better than that. That would not be happening here. And so I looked and found this article. Actually, it was a blog written by this person called Lee Aiken, January 9, 2017. And it talks about the 3 largest states that have human trafficking issues. And one of those states is Georgia, Atlanta being one of the largest hubs. And what was driving this was states that have a large immigrant population as well as international airports. So that kicked it to California, Texas, and Georgia. So here are some numbers to consider: that sex trafficking is a $32 billion industry. It states that Atlanta is one of the largest hubs for human and sex trafficking. And over 1 million children, generally girls between the ages of 12 and 14, are sold into sex trafficking operations every year. Even more disturbing is the amount of children and adults that come into this monthly, and they're looking at a number of like 124,000. And what it gets to and speaks to in this article is that some of the hardest area hit are the rural areas because of the economics, because of the poverty, and just I refer to it as people that have a broken spirit. And that can happen anywhere. That can happen in any situation. But when you are exposed generation after generation to this no hope, then you feel like, well, this may be an option. This may be something workable. And we're seeing that it is something that is definitely, especially this time of year when there's more travel involved, because it can happen so quickly that this person gets pulled into this world because of how busy these airports are. And they actually have now where a lot of the airline employees are trained to kind of have a heads up when things are not looking normal between people traveling together. If there's an older adult and a young child, and that child is just, something is off. And we know when something is off in a situation, and it's about going through a reconciliation process. I think it requires for everybody to be more aware and face the truth, no matter how difficult it is, that we have these issues in our country that we need to address, because there are people that feel like they don't have any hope. So there are several different organizations. There's Georgia Cares. There is Out of Darkness. So hopefully you'll take an opportunity to Google some of these resources. There's the Covenant House of Georgia. So, you can be aware and just, have some information available, so that if you see something then you will feel more empowered to do something. So just because, we're in the wonderful United States of America doesn't mean that we don't have issues that we have to start dealing with. And if we can't even talk about it, then it's a bigger problem, because I think we're seeing that these problems don't go away. They don't disappear. We have to face the truth to get to healing, and typically that healing is painful. One of the things that I was interested in learning more about in coming back into Savannah and living here is, how is Savannah doing culturally wise? How is Savannah doing with different cultures, black, white, getting along, and a larger immigrant population, which Savannah's always been a little bit unique because I think, had diversity. So we're going to listen to a clip from a previous show where this specific topic was addressed by the guest on the show, and it was in reference to how would Savannah be ranked. And as you listen to this, I hope you listen to or take into consideration wherever you are. How would you rank your city or your community or your state? How is it look in your world? Because it's not only Savannah that needs to be asking this question, and I know there are other cities that are dealing with this issue. So let's take a little listen to learn a little bit more about how this is looking as far as Savannah being a city where we are blending and comfortable with talking to each other and working on issues. Living here. So through all of my adult formative years, I was in Texas. So coming back to Savannah, it's very and of course I visited because I have, my family was here. So, but visiting is not the same as
No.
living here. So from your perspective, where do you see Savannah on the spectrum of working through reconciliation? I mean, if you had to, and I hate to do this, but we want that performance measure so bad. If you had to rate it on a scale from, and this is your perspective. So the good part about this show, it's no judgment, right?
Right.
So if you had to rate it on a scale from 1 to 5, with 1 being very ethnocentric, white dominant culture, very entrenched in racism, 1 being kind of like the worst part of the scale, and 5 being more ethno-relative as far as moving towards justice and what needs to be, in that part of the equation for diversity and inclusion. Because what's interesting for me in Savannah, so I'm going to keep talking while you digest on where you're going to rate the scale. What's interesting coming back to Savannah and seeing the demographics of realizing that there is a predominant African American culture, but numbers does not mean that you're the dominant culture. That's the thing that racism has done for this in this country. If I walk into a room and the room is, there are 10 people there, and 8 of those people are African American, and 2 of the people are white, the dominant culture typically still is the white culture. So if you had to, and if you don't want to even go to that scaling thing, it's kind of personally for me, just kind of my own curiosity as I continue to learn more about Savannah. Where would you put Savannah on the spectrum? Because, I definitely don't get the same vibe that I got when I lived in Texas. It appears to be that there is more of an ease, but that's my impression. Not to say that there's not racism, because we have the systemic problem, but how would you rate Savannah on a scale from 1 to 5?
Well, it to me, I like the scale, by the way, but I have to treat it as a bit schizophrenic, in the sense that I think from a cultural tolerance, how we see each other, how we go to events together, participate in camps together, we're doing pretty well. I think we're 4 out of 5.
Okay.
But when it comes to economic integration, when it comes to the real leverage of power in the community, we're much closer to 1, because the way that the economic wealth, the keys to financial success are distributed in this community, it's nowhere near close to what it is in places like Atlanta or Pittsburgh or wherever you might pick. It is still highly economically segregated. I'll give you a great example. I love to play golf, and so I'm a member of the Savannah Golf Club. And as such, it is an organization which is very much open to African Americans, to Hispanics, to Asians. And we have members from those ethnicities. But the vast majority of members are white. And the reason that they are, more than any other reason, is because the
it's
money
expensive.
in the city is in those hands.
Right.
And I can tell you that there's a handful of people there that are racist, but for the most part, most of them aren't. They just have money.
Right.
And so that's why I say it's a bit schizophrenic. Yes, we do see each other. We're not afraid of interacting with each other. We're not afraid of being exposed to one another's cultures, and that's good. You know, from the standpoint of this city. My kids go to a public school, and everybody's there.
Right.
And it's cool. It works out great. But if we go to an event at the golf club, it's not going to represent that same group.
Right. That's a good. I like that. I like that impression that you have about it, because I think in a lot of places it is schizophrenic. Although I won't continue to bash where I moved from, but believe it or not, it's worse than Savannah in that there is not that comfort and ease of interacting with each other at all. I mean, and it's very apparent when you are the person of color. And I definitely don't get that sensation in Savannah, but it could be that I'm still in my honeymoon phase and everything's like, woohoo, I'm home, this is great, But I do recognize from an economic standpoint that, and that's what we're talking about, is like, how do we move towards social justice and economic justice? And to me, it's going through the reconciliation process, going through the healing process, and then you touch base on it, is basically saying, and then taking some action. And that, to me, well, that was a clip from a previous show, and what I did and had, as part of my moving back into the Savannah culture and going to different groups and meetings, there was a presentation with a group, and I got some really pretty disturbing information about Savannah's poverty rate. And this is from a nonprofit here in Savannah called Step Up Savannah, Inc. And they quoted that Savannah's poverty rate is at 26%, and that in some of the neighborhoods, the poverty rate jumps as high as 50%. So when we look at what needs to be done in Savannah, this is a very critical area that needs to be addressed, is how do we move beyond that? So I'm going to take a little break while you digest on that to make some announcements, and we're going to be back to continue on with the One Human Nation show. And as you probably figured out, for this particular show, it's more of a reflective show to look back on some of the previous shows and getting into some topics and really start looking at how we are going to continue on a reconciliation journey when there are so many different topics, issues, social justice issues that continue to come up, that it can be overwhelming if we don't take some steps of how we're going to manage it, how we're going to handle it. And it's not something that's just unique to Savannah. It is an issue that we have nationwide. So I'm going to take a little break and make some announcements. If you enjoy our programming on WRUULP, please support the station with a donation. As an individual, you can give any amount, become a basic station member, or become a serious fan of the station. To check out membership rates and to donate to the station, go to www.wruu.org/individual and select to donate monthly or subscribe to an annual membership. Again, to donate, go to the station at www.org/individual and select to donate monthly or subscribe to an annual membership. Thank you for listening to and supporting WRUULP. The Unitarian Universalist Church of Savannah presents the Sounds and Spirits concert series featuring Uncommon Collective, playing a mix of music genres including holiday favorites. The group's members include harpist Kristen King, vocalist Trey Gurley and J.J. Collins, guitarist Bill Smith, mandolin player Corey Chambers, and bassist Mark Chesino. The concert will take place on Saturday, December 9th at 7 p.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Savannah on Troop Square. For more information, visit uusavannah.org. You're listening to WRUULP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. So before the break, I shared some information with you about Savannah's poverty rate, and I would encourage you in your community to take a look at that, because as we can see from people that are left out of the American dream process, it can be a very destructive process. And I don't believe as a community that we can be whole or we can heal if we just want to pretend that we have a segment of our population that is not have access to this opportunity or to any opportunity, or feel so bleak and left out that it's like, why bother? So we're going to talk a little bit about how we need to change our perception as it relates to education. And I do want to quote, I looked up some particular quotes as it relates to poverty. And there was one, I think you probably have heard it before. This is from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he says, as long as there is poverty in this world, no man can be totally rich, even if he has $1 billion. And that was from his speech, The American Dream. And there was another quote from Nelson Mandela that states, overcoming poverty is not a task of charity. It is an act of justice. Like slavery and apartheid, poverty is not natural. It is man-made, and it can be overcome and eradicated by the actions of human beings. Sometimes it falls on a generation to be great. You can be that great generation. Let your greatness bloom. From Nelson Mandela. So I want to share that with you because I do want this to be, even though some of the topics are dark topics and there's some horrendous things going on in our world, I still believe that we have hope. And one of the sectors in systems that we have access to in this country that really gives me hope is our education system. So I do want to take a listen, have you take a listen to a previous show that the guest talked about their experience in a school system and what they did during their time there to try to make a change with the students that they were reaching out to and touching.
Very, very interesting. And it really explained a lot to me about the beliefs that we have when we grow up, from things like global climate change, whether or not that's something that people believe in, to your basic value in a classroom, a class setting. And so the beauty for me of teaching in Nacogdoches was that I could feel the hunger of the students. I could feel their passion. Now, make no mistake, this is still school. This is still high school, and most of my students did not necessarily love sitting through my algebra and geometry classes. So I'm not saying I converted the masses into loving math, but what they did get was how much I valued their presence there, how important their education was, and how important they were. You want to be able to help people see outside of the confines that they're within. And Nacogdoches was a very small town, and I can remember early on observing a teacher, and she really didn't take the black students to task. The way that I was trained as a teacher was that if somebody answered a question that you gave them, that was great, but you didn't just go over and pat them on the back and say, job well done, and move on. You asked them the next step of the question, and then the step after that. You wanted to push them to their point of ignorance so that you knew at what point your teaching began.
Oh, okay.
And if you didn't do that, you hadn't done your job.
Okay.
So if all you did was ask them a question and they answered it, then they simply knew what the answer was. You didn't actually require them to think. You did not demand anything of them, and you didn't get enough information to know what you needed to be teaching them so that you could actually help make them a better student.
Right.
That was the school of thought that was hammered into me, and still is in any regard. And so when I questioned this teacher about why her standards were so low for the black students, she said, if they don't care, that's fine. We need people to work at Kentucky Fried Chicken and Pizza Hut and Taco Bell.
Oh boy.
And I realized, yeah, that's absolutely right. This world does need those people, right? But when the system essentially dictates who those people are going to be,
right,
through education, we have a real problem. And it was a huge motivator for me. So I started study groups.
So as we listen to that information, it speaks to me about what an important role our education system has for our youth. And I especially see in Savannah where a lot of the youth have really disconnected. And I think it's this article that I'm going to talk to you about is actually from a blog written by a person called Chris Powers, March 28th, 2017. And in this blog, it stated that why we desperately need to bring back vocational training in schools. And it goes on to state that some of the statistics from the National Association of Manufacturers states that an estimated 3.5 million jobs will be needed, yet 2 million are expected to go unfilled in the sector over the course of the next 10 years. He goes on to state that an estimated 2.7 million jobs are likely to be needed as a result of retirements of the existing workforce, while 700,000 jobs are likely to be created due to natural business expansion and growth. In addition, he talks about retirement and a shortage of skilled workforce, such as with the lack of science, technology, engineering, mathematics, or the STEM skills among workers, a gradual decline of technical education programs in public school. And as someone that has recently had to engage plumbers as well as electricians, I could say that, there is much to be said for vocational technical training and not be loaded with a lot of the student loan debt that I saw personally from people that were going through the process of trying to even buy a house, that they had so much student loan debt, they couldn't afford it. And I think along with bringing back the technical, the emphasis on vocational training is we have to change the narrative and the stigma that seems to be attached to blue collar workers. Much of the conversation has been about, well, which college are you going to go to, or, how are your grades? And it's the question maybe should be more of, what would you like to be when you grow up? And identifying at a very early age for those students that have the ability to go more down that vocational path, as opposed to thinking that everyone is going to be geared into college. And I talked to some of my friends about this, and we're both, we were all kind of amazed at how did we get here? How do we get away from thinking that because someone elected not to go to college and they decided to be a plumber, an electrician, or an HVAC repair person or mechanic or whatever the skill set is, that and frankly, why can't you do both if you wanted to? Because you could pay for your school and not be inundated with all of this debt from student loans, which in itself does create another level of poverty, and that's in some studies referred to as the working poor. So this is the season of hope. So I know you're probably thinking, oh my gosh, Sandy's given us a lot to think about. And I do want to touch base on some of these topics in more detail in upcoming shows, and as we get more into what it takes for us to really talk about difficult topics in a safe, honest, and open and productive environment, so that we can learn, so that we can share our stories, and we can start taking action. And in one of the places, especially with this being around the holiday season, that things can get more tension filled is, how do you have those difficult conversations when you're dealing with friends and family, and it's around the holidays and it's the end of the year, and I think people are just kind of fatigued from everything that's happened, whether it's been personally or whether it's on the national level or on the global level, and we're just worn out. So how do you go about having those conversations? So as we look at wrapping up today's show, I want to share with you a reflection on this clip from one of the guests that really went through a reconciliation process in looking at the truth and addressing it and having the conversation about it at a very young age. So let's take a listen to this clip from show 11 that aired previously.
We've talked about this.
Right. So I'm just kind of moving the story along.
When we moved away from that town at the end of my sixth grade year and moved to another town, which was in the midst of its court-ordered integration. So I went through it all over again in another town at another school, and almost right away made friends with two sisters who were very good singers, and I was a singer. And we went to sister churches. They went to the African American version of the white church that I went to, the same
Okay.
denomination, which I won't name. And we sang together a lot, and they became very close friends of mine. And by the time I hit ninth grade, I realized there was a disconnect with how I felt about them and our friendship and the kind of language that was spoken at home.
Okay.
And I remember one night at the dinner table, to my large family of 7, saying, I don't ever want you to speak word in my presence again. And it became quite the hubbub at home.
So I just have to say, because you told me when you said that and you were in the ninth grade and you told your parents at the table, like your siblings at the table, that you did not want to hear the N word again. I can't even imagine if that situation was reversed. So, did what happened?
It was. I remember wide open eyes. I remember that sound that's made in the bleachers, the woo, that sound that's made. I remember my father pulling back from his chair, like really I was afraid he might hit me.
Right.
I remember my mother ducking her head and looking at the floor like, this is really bad. But I remember standing my ground.
Okay.
I remember standing my ground and saying, no more. That's not going to happen when I'm here.
Right. And you did share with me that your mom had a conversation with you several years later.
Yeah.
And so if you want to share that, I thought that was interesting, the conversation, that she had with you.
Yes, later, and I don't remember how much later it was, but it was probably within a 2-year when she saw my resolve and wanted to give me some support, but realized she couldn't do that in front of my father because he was, I will not be harsh in that when she was growing up in Houston, she and her father, my grandfather, were walking downtown Houston doing some window shopping. And she said she looked up and saw a beautiful woman in a red dress with a purse and shoes that matched nearby. And she said, she told me that the woman was a black woman.
Mm-hmm.
And she turned to her father, and I think she said she was 6 years old. She turned to her father and said, look at that beautiful lady. And he looked at her with such disdain and said, she is no lady.
Mm.
And my mother said it broke her heart, but that they never spoke of it again.
Wow.
And I knew that my mother was messaging me, stay on this road. I just can't help you.
Wow. Well, that was one of the excerpts from one of the previous shows that really speaks to the courage it takes to have these conversations. And so you may be at that stage where you want to engage in those conversations more in depth with friends and family. And what I can say to you is, number one, be prepared, have information available and not do it in a threatening way. And hopefully as you go through the holiday season, you are in surroundings that are in around people that are supportive, but recognizing the fact that for many people, that's the time when all of the all of the skeletons in the closet come out, and you're around people that you prefer not to be around, but they're your family, and you're thinking, well, what can I do to have a voice, to say something, and maybe have a different narrative for this person. But start with looking at your own internal unconscious bias. Don't go into it with a judgment attitude. So I do want to note to you that if you want to listen more in depth to the shows that we just listened to a short clip today, the show numbers that you would need to go to at the One Human Nation website, which is onehumannation.info, it would be show 12, show 14, show 21, and show 11. Again, those shows are 12, 14, 21, and 11. So thank you for listening to the One Human Nation show today. And I hope this has given you some reflection for the holiday season that we're in. And as we head into the upcoming year, I hope you're encouraged to have some hope and go into a little deeper dive with your own unconscious bias. If you haven't taken the implicit association test, you can also do those from the One Human Nation website, and there's quite a variety to plug into there to get a better gauge of your own internal unconscious bias. Next up, we're going to be, as we wrap up today's show, it's going to be the upcoming show with Troy Stoner, Sound Limit. And as I prepare for him to come in, I hope you have a good week. I hope you maintain hope and a positive attitude in spite of things that are happening in our world. To me, it's all part and parcel of this process of truth and healing and reconciliation. Thank you for listening to the One Human Nation show, and we'll be talking with you next.